And then the next item of business today is a members' business debate on motion number 7602 in the name of Jackie Baillie on Challenge Poverty Week. This debate will be concluded without any questions being put, and would those members who wish to speak in the debate please press the request to speak buttons now or as soon as possible. I now call on Jackie Baillie, 7 minutes or thereby. Please, Ms Baillie.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer, and it gives me great pleasure to be moving this motion today, highlighting Scotland's first Challenge Poverty Week. Can I thank members for the cross-party support and thank the very many organisations that are behind the Challenge Poverty Week and that provided us briefings for this debate. The organisations are too numerous to mention, but include the Poverty Alliance, the STUC, SCVO, Oxfam and many children's organisations besides. The rationale for holding a Challenge Poverty Week is twofold. Firstly, the UN International Day for the Eradication of Poverty takes place each year on the 17th of October, and the aim is to highlight the reality of poverty across the world and build a greater momentum for action. Secondly, there is no doubt that child poverty is likely to rise, and we need to galvanise public opinion and galvanise policymakers to do more to tackle the challenge. So between the 13th and the 19th of October, a wide range of organisations and individuals will come together to do four things. Firstly, to highlight the reality of poverty. Secondly, to demonstrate what is being done to address poverty, both by the government and local authorities and health boards, and principally also by voluntary organisations and communities themselves. Thirdly, addressing the stereotypes about poverty, and I'll say a bit more about that later. And fourthly, and perhaps most importantly, creating support for action to address poverty. At the heart of all of this is making sure that the voices of people who are experiencing poverty are heard and that they are central to sharing and shaping our approach as we move forward. I hope that politicians at all levels will engage positively with the Challenge Poverty Week, whether at national events or indeed at local dialogue meetings that are being arranged by the Poverty Alliance. It was only yesterday, Presiding Officer, that we debated the cost of living crisis, and whilst at times the debate was certainly very robust, there is no doubting, I think, in anybody's mind the scale of the problem that we face. With declining incomes and rising prices, people and families on low incomes are struggling. And let me stress, this isn't just about people who are unfortunate enough to be unemployed. These are people who are in employment too. We clearly need to address in-work poverty and make work pay, and we have proposals to strengthen the national minimum wage and embed the living wage in the forthcoming procurement bill. Around 400 employers across the UK are now living wage employers, and I congratulate them. But you know, only a tiny handful are Scottish employers, and there is much the government can do to improve that situation. A truly appalling statistic that we heard yesterday, briefly.
Mason.
Yes, thank you. Just on this point of the national minimum wage and the living wage is always going to be partly voluntary. Would it not be better to have a national minimum wage that's statutory?
Jackie Baillie.
We do have a national minimum wage that is a matter of statute. The issue is making sure it increases commensurate with the rate of inflation so that its true value is felt. But under the Conservative government, it has declined substantially to 2004 levels, which I think, frankly, is shocking. But another truly appalling statistic that we heard yesterday suggested that 1 in 10 people in Scotland had to borrow money for food in July. That's over 500,000 people. For some, it was from family and friends. For others, it was from payday loan lenders, money they will be unable to pay back due to the exorbitant interest rates. We have food banks being set up in our communities by a number of different voluntary organisations, and we are grateful for their efforts. But you know, in 21st century Scotland, this should not be happening. We also have an ambitious pledge to end fuel poverty by 2016. Yet I don't know if we are on track to deliver this because the Scottish Government won't say. We have 900,000 households currently in fuel poverty. It is a huge national scandal, but we can tackle this and we must tackle this. Ed Miliband announced a proposal to freeze electricity and gas prices until 2017, a practical measure that spoke to the reality of the challenges facing people in communities across the country. But yesterday, that was met with either a deafening silence or sharp criticism. Today, we saw Fergus Ewing give the game away. None of you agree with it, and you are on the side of the energy companies and not on the side of ordinary people. And instead, budgets for fuel poverty have been cut. And on child poverty, I spoke yesterday of the efforts made to tackle child poverty in Scotland. It is a fact that we achieved a greater fall in Scotland than anywhere else in the UK, and by 2007, we had the lowest rates of child poverty in the country. But I'm not complacent. They were still too high. But it is a fact that in Labour's period in office, from 1999 to 2007, we reduced relative poverty by 1/3. We reduced absolute poverty by 2/3. But since then, progress has stalled. And the real and pressing concern for us is that poverty levels are now rising. We see the evidence of that in our communities, and we need to act now because we know the consequences of child poverty are truly severe. A child growing up in poverty is likely to suffer from poor health, lower educational attainment, unemployment, experience financial hardship, food poverty, fuel poverty, and ultimately die younger. Their life chances as adults may well be shaped before they reach the age of 3. It is therefore critical that we intervene, and we intervene early, because poverty is not inevitable. Real change is possible. Scottish Government has a child poverty strategy, but progress in implementing it has been slow. And I welcome the commitment to refresh the strategy, but there is also a need to refresh the Achieving Our Potential framework. It was developed in 2008, before the real hit from the recession. It needs to be updated to reflect the current crisis in living standards and the current crisis in poverty. It needs to be a driver for change at all levels of government, and I hope the Minister will tell us that the Scottish Government will do that. Let me turn to the Scottish Welfare Fund, because it is disappointing that only half of what could have been spent has actually been spent. And I'm sure the Minister shares that disappointment, because there's no doubt about the level of need out there. So I would urge the Government, work with local authorities, identify if there are unintended barriers to people accessing that much needed support from crisis grants. And I don't think any one of us underestimate the scale of concern that exists over welfare cuts, and that includes the bedroom tax. A flawed piece of legislation that assumes that there are sufficient one-bedroom properties available, which is frankly nonsense. I hope that the Scottish Government will see its way to supporting the call for £50 million and protection for social tenants. But finally, Presiding Officer, I want to talk very briefly about perceptions. In recent years, the debate about poverty has been characterised by negative language. Phrases like shirkers pepper the speeches of some politicians. Public opinion suggests that people think the unemployed are lazy or lack willpower. There is hope in the recent British Social Attitudes Survey that suggests that this might be changing. But we have a responsibility to take the lead in ensuring that there is a better understanding of the reality of poverty, and you really get that by listening to the people who have or are experiencing it. We are facing a crisis in the cost of living. We're seeing increasing levels of poverty. A decade of progress in reducing child poverty and family deprivation is being reversed. Challenge Poverty Week, Presiding Officer, is a wake-up call for all of us. Let's match that call with action now to tackle poverty in Scotland.
Many thanks. I now call on John Wilson to be followed by Alex Johnson, 4 minutes or thereby. Please.
Thank you, Deputy Presiding Officer. May I congratulate Jackie Baillie on securing the members' debate on Challenge Poverty Week. This does seem a bit like Groundhog Day, but I'm quite happy to have this debate every day if we can eradicate poverty by having the debate. I have to declare that I formerly worked for the Poverty Alliance, and someone who experienced childhood poverty realised the issues that are being faced by many people today. I know that poverty is unacceptable in the modern 21st century Scotland, and in many ways it is a sad situation we find ourselves discussing the issue of poverty when its awful reality and associated consequences should have been dispatched to history. I am aware that over the years there have been various debates on the subject of the poverty initiated by members across this chamber. In fact, I am reminded of the time a good friend of Jackie Baillie, one John Park, quite rightly made reference in a previous debate that politicians talk about inward poverty, while people in the real world talk about trying to make ends meet. Poverty should not be underestimated. It has a lasting impact on our children's education and achievement, and it fails to develop Scotland's potential for growth, especially individual progress of people. With 11% of pupils leaving without any qualifications in the most deprived areas of Scotland, compared to 3% for the rest of Scotland. The factors that drive poverty are diverse, but more challenging than ever. For far too long, we have relied upon various welfare-to-work schemes, or should I say, in the phrase that's being used this week, workfare will somehow solve poverty without a real rise in the incomes of those in or out of employment. Poverty is wasteful since the problems it creates means we as a society are regularly trying to catch up, creating projects of various types to tackle the symptoms instead of the root causes. One of the strengths of Scottish Government policy with regard to poverty over the recent past is the acknowledgement that poverty is multifaceted, and quite rightly, that emphasis should be acknowledged. It is a poor indicator of society that in my lifetime we have had soup kitchens and the creation of food banks to distribute food parcels. I would like to place on record my thanks and appreciation to the various organisations who gather the food and distribute food to those most in need. The reality is we should not have to be doing that. The income levels of those households should be sufficient to live and survive without depending on handouts from charitable organisations. Constituents and some employers keep telling me that there is now confusion taking place between the living wage and the national minimum wage, and why figures vary so much. And clearly, in the debate yesterday, we raised the issue about how the living wage could bring in a meaningful income for households that would allow them to survive. And I'm not saying that it would be a handsome income, but it would be a step in the right direction to securing the prosperity of households. I am currently the convener of the cross-party group on credit unions. I would like to recognise the good work credit unions do in encouraging people to save and take loans with them, particularly in light of Jackie Baillie's comment about the payday loan companies and the problems that these companies are causing at the present moment. Scottish Government, in terms of its new economic strategy, recognises that opportunities should be created for all of Scotland's people to flourish. Hopefully, the National Performance Framework which has cross-party support, can assist in reducing the income gaps in our society and provide better social cohesion. I take this opportunity to thank the number of organisations who continue to advance the campaign and highlight their useful contributions to the debate on tackling poverty, and wish them every success in the campaign to eradicate poverty as quickly as possible, and look forward to the day when we can show that we have resolved the issues of poverty in Scotland once and for all. I congratulate Jackie Baillie once again on the debate.
Many thanks. Now call on Alex Johnson to be followed by Sarah Boyack.
Thank you very much, Deputy Presiding Officer. I welcome the fact that Jackie Baillie has brought this issue to Parliament for debate today, and I congratulate the Poverty Alliance for the work it has done and will continue to do in this area. There's a great deal that I and Jackie Baillie could disagree on, and I don't intend to dwell on these things today. However, anyone who wants to know about them, I refer them to the official report from yesterday, and we can leave it at that. However, there are one or two things I would like to say about the issue of poverty which do cause me concern, and I would like to be taken into consideration in this broader discussion. Jackie Baillie herself highlighted the difference between relative poverty and absolute poverty. Sometimes we dwell on the figures for relative poverty, and of course, if you define poverty as a percentage of medium income, then from a mathematical point of view, poverty will always be there, and it will always be there in the same proportion, which is why my concern is more about levels of absolute poverty. Because anyone who looks at what goes on across Scotland cannot fail to be impressed, disappointed by the contrasts which exist. And my concern is about why these contrasts exist and why we find it difficult to escape these extreme contrasts. The definition of poverty can vary, but many people, of course, consider it to be simple lack of means to achieve what they need to do in their daily lives. Yet, that poverty can also be defined in some areas as a poverty of ambition. And I don't wish to make that as a criticism of individuals. It is, in fact, the sum total of generations of neglect by successive governments. That's why I want to see people raise their aim. I want to see individuals from all levels of the communities affected working together to ensure that they are successful in relieving poverty in the long term. And that means taking back possession of our lives as individuals and encouraging those in the most deprived of situations to do exactly that. We need to return ambition to those who are in our poorest communities. That's why I'm disappointed to hear proposals that were aired at the Conservative Party conference this week described simply as workfare. The issue, I'm sorry, I've limited time and I want to get finished. Describing the proposals that were brought forward this week as workfare were, in my view, an unfair description of what was proposed. The concern specifically was about the long-term unemployed. And of course, the long-term unemployed are in a very difficult situation, especially in those communities where there are large numbers of them. When a job becomes available, the chances of someone who has been unemployed for over 2 years getting these jobs is extremely slim indeed. That's why the government have come forward with a proposal that is designed to help those who are long-term unemployed. Certainly, 1/3 of them may be asked to do community work. Another third will be asked to attend a job centre on a daily basis, giving them the opportunity to return to a daily routine which will help to prepare them for the workplace. Because if you get a job and you don't turn up for it, you're not going to hold on to it very long. More importantly, perhaps, that final third will be offered direct assistance, one-to-one assistance with the key problem that has kept them unemployed for that time. And that may be simple things like literacy. It may be more complex things like substance dependency and substance abuse. But that work is essential. And where a national government comes forward with proposals, I think Scotland does itself no credit when every organisation, every political party comes forward and attacks what they see as their interpretation of these measures without taking the trouble to understand what these measures actually mean and what they're designed for. This government, this UK government, has done all it can to protect those who are in work poverty by taking huge numbers of people out of tax and relieving everybody of £700 of tax if you're in work. They have done their bit to make work pay. We need to make sure that poverty is dealt with by creating jobs and getting the unemployed into them. That's my ambition for the poor, and I hope that we can raise the ambition of the organisations that support them as well.
Many thanks. Now call on Sarah Boyack to be followed by John Mason.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. And if I can say to the Chamber now, I'm going to have to leave before the end of this debate, but I promise I will read the transcript thereafter. Can I also say I want to congratulate Jackie Baillie for raising this topic today. It is an absolutely central topic for us to be discussing in the Chamber. I think the comments from the briefing that we got from the Challenge Poverty Week absolutely nailed it on the head. Poverty is not inevitable and real change is possible. And I think that has to be our starting point. And I wanted to shine a light on one particular issue because I think the briefing from the Challenge Poverty Week was absolutely right, that we need to think through the fundamental issues that underlie poverty, and that's all about inequality. And we need to accept that even when we make gains, those gains are not necessarily just accepted and then we can all move on. The challenge of inequality and poverty is that we need sustained action from government and we need sustained action over time. Just think of the young people who were supported by the Sure Start initiative, supported through Better Schools by the last Labour government, who now come out of school at the worst employment time for a generation. We need to think about the path the right way throughout people's lives. And while there's been some excellent focus on child poverty, and Jackie Baillie's own speech was excellent in that regard, I want to just focus on one tiny part of this debate, which is about the issue of fuel poverty, and think about the challenge for our older people. Now, there has been investment in tackling fuel poverty. The first 2 terms of this Parliament saw huge amounts of investment in boilers for older people so that they could upgrade the systems and that they could afford to heat their houses, but do it in a way that was environmentally sustainable. Now, we don't have that scheme now, and looking at the Age Concern Scotland report called Mind the Gap, they've been looking at the challenge of enabling current older people to get access to fuel poverty measures. And their research shows that while awareness of the energy efficient schemes that the government's running is actually quite high, very few people apply for them. And I know from my own mailbag that out of the pensioners that do apply for that support, many of them are not deemed eligible and are then consigned to live in properties that they can't heat properly and that they can't afford to heat. And there's a real challenge here. And Age Concern Scotland has raised a real concern about the Scottish Government's funds, which have been underspent in heaps and are now going to be reallocated. I think we need to understand why that money hasn't been spent, and we need to redouble our efforts to make sure that that money is spent on the issue that it was identified to deal with. So I hope the Minister will look into this. We need to have a greater focus. We need to be looking at targeting investment that will challenge the problem of poverty amongst our older people. We've debated a lot over the last few days the issue of rising fuel prices, quite rightly, and there's action that could and should be taken on that. But look at the number of older people who haven't had that support of getting new boilers, who live in owner-occupied or private rented housing that is incredibly poorly maintained and doesn't have the right standards of energy efficiency, with out-of-date, expensive heating systems. The current system isn't working, and we have a problem about many older people are not online, they're not able to access the advice that's absolutely crucial. So as I say, it's just one aspect of this debate, but I think it's something that on all aspects of poverty, we need to drill down into the detail. We need to have our ambition absolutely right, and we need to focus on inequality. It needs to be sustained, but we need to do the work and looking at each individual policy that will actually tackle poverty, because that, at the moment, is not what's happening. Thank you, Presiding Officer.
And thank you. And I now call on John Mason to be followed by Drew Smith.
Thank you, Presiding Officer, and thank you to Jackie Baillie for bringing forward this debate. Clearly, we discussed the rising cost of living yesterday, and much of that material, I think, is relevant today as well. When I was reading some of the briefings for today, I was wondering what line I would take. And I think it is this contrast between wealth and poverty, when some have so much and some have so little, that I want to concentrate on. Clearly, there are always going to be some variations in society between the income of some and others and the wealth of some and others. I remember a previous boss of mine saying that people can be quite happy if one person has got a Rolls Royce as long as they have got a Mini. Maybe that is the case. But when one person has 2 Rolls Royces and their neighbour has no Mini or anything else, then we know that something is definitely wrong. On Sunday, I attended 2 church services in my constituency, one Catholic and one Church of Scotland, and at both of these the reading was about the rich man and Lazarus, which I assume some members might be familiar with. But briefly, the rich man went through his life without really even noticing the poor man Lazarus, who sat begging outside his house. And if we do one thing from today, I hope it is that we notice and re-emphasise that this is a problem. We are a wealthy country, whether it's Scotland or it's the UK. So why is there all this poverty? Part of the answer has to be how the income and wealth is shared out. That is, they are not shared out very well. I'm happy to accept that part of the answer is that we need better quality jobs and better paid jobs at the lower end. That links to having a living wage that hopefully will become statutory at some stage. And I think that's the basic argument of Commonweal, who I know have been speaking both to ourselves and I believe to the Labour Party as well, and I think a lot of us are sympathetic to that. However, I don't think that is the whole answer. I think we have to accept that some people are getting too much. At least in the short term, the economy is not going to grow dramatically. So how we distribute the income and wealth of this country is significant. One option is to limit the income of those at the top, but I think that is easier said than done. In yesterday's debate, the Green Amendment, which we did not actually discuss, suggested maximum pay ratios, and that does appeal to me in some ways. However, I know that attempts have been made to do this in the past, and it has proven very difficult to do. However, the longer-term answer has to be challenging the underlying greed in all this. those people that take 10 or 20 times more income than they pay some of their staff. Now, that is also easier said than done, but at least I think it should be said. Yes, very quickly.
Finlay.
He's hardly said a word that I would disagree with. And in the ding-dong in here, we often don't get to discuss things quietly like this. I wonder if I could seriously put the point to him, I genuinely put this point, that what he's proposing, how does the corporation tax policy that's been pursued sit with that? And I'm genuinely asking that. Please, I'm not trying to trip him up on a political point. I'm genuinely asking him that.
Okay, I mean, I think he and I have discussed this a few times, and we'll probably discuss it a few times more, but just very, very briefly, I think I also have reservations about cutting any of the taxes, frankly, and I think the only justification for cutting corporation tax is to pull in more jobs, and you get more PAYE and things, but that's really as far as I'm going to go just now. But changing attitudes is something we have to do, and I think that's probably in many ways beyond the power of this or any other parliament. Therefore, assuming that incomes will vary widely, the other option is to use taxation powers to redistribute. The present range of income tax is from 20% to 45–50%, and it's not really very wide-ranging. And when you add in national insurance on top of that, it means that the starting rate is effectively 30%. I have to say I was very disappointed when the 10% rate was abolished, and personally, I would like to see the lowest rate being 10% again, inclusive of national insurance, and then perhaps going up in bands of 10%. Now, I do remember 98%, that was probably too high, but we could go in that direction. So in summary, I'm pleased that we're talking about this subject today. We need to grow the economy, but whether or not we do, we need to share our resources more fairly. Thank you.
Thank you. We now call on Drew Smith to be followed by Neil Finlay.
Thank you very much, Presiding Officer. Congratulate Jackie Baillie as others have done. Just quickly on a reflection of Mr Mason's speech, I actually very much agree with him on the whole issue of pay ratios and differentials. And it would be interesting if the Minister in closing maybe just touched on this, because I think the one thing that we could do at the moment would be to commit to measure. And that if we had a commitment from the public sector to at least produce some of the statistics around this, then I think it would help us to get to a point where the outcome that Mr Mason suggested would be more deliverable in the future. I just want to say Challenge Poverty Week is an excellent initiative, and I also want to congratulate the Poverty Alliance and everyone who's been involved in developing the idea. And John Mason also mentioned the importance of Christian teaching and what the Church has to say about some of these issues. And I was struck last year by a comment that was made to me by Sally Foster-Fulton of the Church of Scotland, when she said, you know, the Christian view that the poor are always with us is not meant as a defence, it's supposed to be a challenge. And I think the policy debate around poverty and how to tackle it, you know, often we do create this distinction, which Alec Johnson mentioned, between absolute poverty and relative poverty. And Jackie Baillie mentioned the progress that actually the last Labour government made on both. And on absolute poverty, I think there is a reasonable political consensus that eradication is achievable in a country with our wealth and resources, and that also we should seek to export that campaign against absolute poverty to other corners of the globe. But it's relative poverty where our politics tends to divide us, and to some extent I think the division reflects differing views amidst the public at large, between those who are prepared to accept the inevitability of some poverty for other people. People are rarely persuaded to accept the inevitability of poverty for themselves or their families. And in order to accept the inevitability of poverty, we must divide others into those who deserve our support and essentially those who deserve their fate. And I think that the opportunity of Challenge Poverty Week will play a very important role in encouraging us all to reject that approach. President Officer, I just wanted to concentrate my remarks around poverty as it affects the people that I represent in Glasgow. And the first thing to say, of course, is that Glasgow is not a poor city in many respects. And the City Council, I think, rightly does promote the fact that Glasgow is the powerhouse of the Scottish economy and that Glasgow's success is vital to our city region and indeed to all of Scotland. And quite often the debate about Glasgow's problems, particularly in the media, but sometimes too in the political debate about the leadership of the city, depict a city which is a victim of poverty rather than actually a survivor of it. So rather than listing the many challenges of Glasgow, which are deep-rooted, and also some of the presented solutions to this, which I think are often superficial and can be patronising. I just wanted to make a couple of observations. And one is that because of the scale of the challenge which Glasgow faces, I don't believe it's possible actually to have a serious plan to tackle poverty in Scotland without having a very serious commitment towards Glasgow. And that's not to say that the lived experience of poverty in Glasgow is worse than it is elsewhere, or that poverty in Scotland is somehow a uniquely Glasgow issue. But it's to recognise that in all the big issues, health and life expectancy, education, quality of work, all of which add up to quality of life, the scale of Glasgow represents a capacity to intervene, which we can't ignore. And in fact, it's our biggest opportunity to turn our faces against the idea that poverty is inevitable. And the second point I wanted to make is that, I'm talking about my city, there is something else that needs to be at the heart of Challenge Poverty Week, and that is the importance of individual human voices in establishing what is to be done. I can say I care about poverty in my city, and it's part of my job to try and advocate on behalf of the people that I represent. But we can all put in place programmes to assist people and whatever else, but it's only actually when the voices of those people who actually have the lived experience of worklessness, whether that's because of lack of a job or because they're unable to work, or whether they face exploitation of work, that will actually ever sustain real change around this. And in yesterday's cost of living debate, which has been mentioned, Ian Gray talked about the missing billion which has vanished from the anti-poverty programme since 2007. And I have to say, I know from the conversations I've had with poverty campaigners that there is a feeling out there that we've lost focus on tackling poverty. And I might not support many of the changes to the welfare system being pursued by the UK government, or some of the priorities of this Scottish government, presiding officer. But I just want to end by making the point that the only way to get a proper understanding, those things are not the causes of poverty. The only way to get an understanding of the real causes and solutions and the scrutiny of the budgets is when the voices of those people who are actually affected are heard properly in this debate. And I very much hope that Challenge Poverty Week presents an opportunity to do that, and I'm grateful to you, Presiding Officer.
Thanks. Many thanks. Now call on Neil Finlay, and after which we'll move to the closing speech from the Minister.
Thanks, Presiding Officer. I didn't intend speaking in this debate, but it has been a very good one. And just to make a few brief comments through my life and my community and in my street, and having worked in the social housing sector previously in places like Broomhouse, Wester Hales and across West Lothian, and also having worked in education in many communities, I've seen very much at first hand the impact of crushing poverty on people. People who I regard as being people like me in my class, people who have been drained by the desperate attempt to keep their family together and a roof over their heads, and people who desperately want to look after their family but find it difficult to clothe their kids and put food in their bellies. And it fills me with absolute rage when I hear some politicians and media commentators who have no concept whatsoever of having to live on employment support allowance, or no concept of living with a long-term condition with ATOS hassling you to get a job that doesn't exist, or no concept of the indignity of queuing at a food bank or hiding from the housing officer who's sent to collect the rent. That really fills me with rage when I hear people speaking about the low-paid and the unemployed and have no idea what their life is like. We don't need people patronising the low-paid and the poor. We need to see the colour of their money and their policies to help them and to help change their life. I certainly commend my colleague Jackie Baillie for bringing this debate forward. And I think one thing that people could do if they want to see what's happening in people's day-to-day life is I would encourage people to contact their local council or their housing association and go along, not to don a hard hat or a high-vis vest to cut a ribbon, but to actually go out with a housing officer and see what's happening on the front line to people in the real world. Because many in the community in the situation they find themselves it's not just a difficult situation, it's a scandalous situation in what we attempt to call a civilised society. On the bigger picture, I find myself agreeing with a great deal of what John Mason said in his speech. I don't know if that should worry him or me, but I think we absolutely do need a taxation system and an economic system that puts addressing inequality and unfairness at the very heart of policy making and at the very heart of budget decisions. I certainly would commend the churches, the trade unions, the vast range of community groups who work every day on this agenda. Drew Smith and I, 2 years ago or a year and a half ago, went to the General Assembly of the Church of Scotland to hear their report on their commission into economic activity. I would commend that report to everyone, a fantastic piece of work. I hope that in the future some of the recommendations that they made in that report come to fruition. Thank you.
Thank you. I now call the Minister, Margaret Burgess, to close this debate on behalf of the Government. Up to 7 minutes, please, Minister.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. Like others, I would start by congratulating Jackie Baillie for securing this debate because, as I said previously, every opportunity for this Parliament to make its voice heard in tackling poverty and inequality in Scotland is a valuable one. And I'd also like to thank the Poverty Alliance for organising the Challenge Poverty Week, because tackling the fundamental issue is a key priority for this government. And I'm fully supportive of the work of the Poverty Alliance in this area. Having spoken at a number of their events over the last year, I appreciate just how important it is to challenge poverty and the myths around it, as the Poverty Alliance are doing through their Stick Your Labels campaign. And I think it's clear that we have to continue to work together if we have to effectively tackle poverty and dispel the myths around those in poverty and receipt of benefits. And I think every member would agree with that. There are myths going around poverty, perilled, I have to say, in many instances by part of the current UK government and by some of the media, and I've said that before, and I don't apologise for saying it again. And I do understand about poverty and how it affects people. For most of my life, I've been involved in frontline services dealing with the most vulnerable groups in our society, the low income, those in benefits, and sick and disabled. And I absolutely understand the circumstances they're in. And I really can't stomach it when I hear these people being labelled from some quarters as scroungers, when in fact we should be working to understand the issues and help as much as we can. And I think the Poverty Alliance works very hard in trying to aware the awareness of poverty, and we recognise that in our 2013 Child Poverty Strategy. We have to listen to those affected by poverty and to what they need rather than what we think they need. And that's why I regularly meet with groups around the country and from the Poverty Alliance. I recently met a group from the Poverty Alliance to look at how we can inform our strategy on health inequalities, and it was to listen to what people in poverty were saying and the issues that are affecting them. It was a positive meeting, and we got lots of practical suggestions to consider, and we will certainly consider them and take some forward. But the Scottish Government is committed to a long-term preventative approach to tackle the key drivers of poverty, and will continue this through the revised Child Poverty Strategy, which will be published in the spring. The Scottish Government will continue to protect household incomes. We recognise very long time ago the cost of living was a real issue for people out there, and that's why we introduced what we call the social wage, free personal care for the elderly, abolition of tuition fees, ending bridge tolls and prescription charges, free eye examinations, freezing the council tax, concessionary bus travel for the elderly and disabled, and increasing the provision of nursery education. All of these things are to help people who are struggling, and it is about people getting by, trying to make ends meet. We're leading, for example, in terms of the Scottish living wage, ensuring that all employees that the Scottish Government is responsible for will receive at least the Scottish minimum, the Scottish living wage. We're encouraging other organisations to do that, and recently another housing association came board and announced that they've now a living wage employer, and it's about leading by example.
Jackie Baillie.
I absolutely accept what she says about what the Scottish Government is doing, and indeed local government too. But I wonder whether the Scottish Government would take the opportunity presented by their procurement bill to make sure we spread that good practice to the private sector as well.
Minister.
The Scottish Government is considering that and looking at that closely in the procurement bill, but as Jackie Baillie well knows, we have to look at the European rules surrounding that as well. But that is something that has been looked at. We want to ensure that where the living wage can be paid, it will be paid, and lots of local authorities are looking at that. I'm almost running out of time.
John Wilson.
So, thank the Minister for giving way. Would the Minister accept that even with the introduction of the living wage, there has to be decent contracts and working hours with that, and that we have to end this scandal of 0-hour or 5-hour contracts being issued to staff, particularly in the local authority areas through some of the ALIOs?
Thank you. Minister, take as long as you need.
Okay, thank you, Presiding Officer. In terms of what the member has mentioned, certainly I absolutely agree there has to be good terms and conditions in any contract, and I also recognise that the living wage is a step in reducing inequality and will not solve the poverty situation as a one-off. So we're looking at every way we can to reduce poverty throughout Scotland. And a number of issues have been raised at the start, which I found disappointing in terms of bringing the politics into it. But we are doing what we can in terms of mitigating the worst impacts of welfare reform. We already have provided £40 million to protect people from the UK Government 10% cut in council tax benefit for successor arrangements, £7.9 million for advice and support services, and £9.2 million to top up the new Scottish Welfare Fund. And I will say a bit about that. It is a new fund. It is disappointing to all of us that that fund hasn't been taken up to the extent that we wanted it. We are doing a thorough review of that currently. The guidance has been changed to make it clearer to local authorities, because this fund is administered by local authorities. We're looking at working on how we can improve the consistency of it throughout Scotland, and I think our commitment to that fund was absolutely clear when the Cabinet Secretary for Finance and Sustainable Growth announced that it would keep that budget level at the same for the next 2 years. So it's not a fund that we anticipate reducing just now. It is a fund that we want to see the take-up of, and we'll be advertising and doing everything possible to ensure that every penny of that fund is used for the vulnerable people that require it. Also, in terms of fuel poverty, the Scottish Government continues to provide funding for the fuel poor. We have our HEAP scheme, and the reason why I think a question was asked, why was the HEAP scheme not taken up? It wasn't taken up because of the difficulties we had at the start of understanding or not understanding of the Ofgem and the UK Government determining the rules for the ECO. And that fund, we reckoned there would be an underspend, and that underspend was used to help provide some of the £20 million that we're using to mitigate the bedroom tax. And I think that should be recognised, because it shows the difficulties to find that money, and we did find it, and we made sure it was going back to vulnerable people. But again, the fuel poverty budget will remain the same for the next 2 years. We have not reduced the budget for the following 2 years, because we expect the HEAPS fund to be up and running, the contracts going, and fuel poverty being reduced in Scotland. And the other thing I would say about fuel poverty is that we continue, unlike the UK Government, to support fuel poverty projects. We commit £79 million to fuel poverty projects in Scotland, and to help the very people that Sarah Boyack was talking about. We continued to the Energy Advice Scheme, which was a replacement of the Energy Assistance Package, because we recognised that under the UK schemes there were people still going to be missing out, and we therefore committed to £16 million for the next 2 years for the Energy Assistance Scheme. So we are addressing fuel poverty. But I think what I would say, just before I wind up, Presiding Officer, I realise I've gone beyond my time. We'll continue to take action to address fuel poverty. It is a long-term commitment, and one that we are committed to, and it needs the support of all of us here today. And I think that I'm more than ever convinced that to deal with it properly, we require to be in charge of our own economy, our own welfare system, that we can fully integrate them to deal with the poverty in our society. Thank you.
Many thanks. I now suspend this meeting of Parliament until 2:30. Thank you.